used to think that the worst thing about Alaska was the cold, that brutal, skin-biting wind that freezes the moisture in your eyes the second you step outside. But I was wrong. The cold is merciful. The cold just puts you to sleep. The worst thing is the silence of the earth when you are 800 meters beneath the frozen surface. My name is Arthur. I am the sole winter caretaker of the Blackwood Ridge mining facility, located in the absolute middle of nowhere, 300 miles north of Fairbanks. From November to April, the company shuts down production due to the extreme blizzards. They leave only one person behind to ensure the main water pumps do not freeze and collapse the lower shafts. This year, that person was me. The job was supposed to be simple. Every 6 hours, I had to take the old industrial elevator down to Sector 4, the lowest, oldest part of the mine. I had to check the pressure valves, change the hydraulic filters, and go back up to my warm cabin on the surface. For the first 3 weeks, the only monsters I faced were my own thoughts. The isolation eats away at you slowly, like rust on old iron. You start talking to yourself. You start giving names to the rusty pipes and the mice that scurry through the shadows. But on December 12th, the mice disappeared. It was 2 a.m. when I stepped into the cage of the elevator. The rusted steel cables groaned as they lowered me into the vertical abyss. Down and down past Sector 1, Sector 2, Sector 3. The air grew thicker, heavier, smelling of damp rock, old sweat, and oil. When the cage finally slammed against the floor of Sector 4, the elevator lights flickered twice and died. I was not worried. The grid down here was notoriously unstable. I clicked on my heavy-duty halogen flashlight, the thick yellow beam cutting through the dense underground fog. I stepped out onto the flooded tracks of the old mining carts. The water was ankle-deep, freezing cold through my rubber boots. Splash, splash, splash. The sound of my own footsteps echoed down the long, narrow tunnel. As I stopped to adjust my tool belt, the echo did not stop immediately. There was one extra splash, splash. I froze. I held my breath, listening so hard that I could hear the rapid thumping of my own heart against my ribs. The tunnel was long, extending for nearly 2 miles into the dead heart of the mountain. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the massive weight of the rocks above me. For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady metallic drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. I shook my head, blaming the sensory deprivation. I walked toward the primary pump station, a massive concrete room carved directly into the stone wall. I turned the heavy iron wheel of the pressure valve, the metal screeching in protest. As the loud mechanical noise echoed through the shaft, I heard something else beneath it. A radio transmission. It was faint, coming from the dark, collapsed end of the tunnel. A section that had been sealed off since a fatal cave-in back in 1974. I walked toward the wooden barricade. The yellow beam of my flashlight illuminated the old rotting planks of wood and the warning sign painted in faded red. "Do not enter. Structural failure." Behind the wood inside the dark cavity of the collapsed shaft, a voice was coming through the radio static. "Arthur, do you copy? Arthur, this is the surface cabin. We have a breach." My blood turned to ice. The voice coming through the static. It was my own voice. It had the exact same breathing pattern, the same slight raspy tone from the cold, the same nervous twitch in the pronunciation of my own name. "Arthur, if you are down there, do not use the elevator. Something is climbing the shafts. I stood paralyzed, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The radio in my pocket was switched off. The battery was dead. Yet the voice was getting louder, not from the radio, but from the darkness behind the collapsed rocks. It was mimicking the sound of static with its own throat, making a sickening hissing noise between the words. "Shh, Arthur, shh. Open the door. It is cold out here." The voice changed. It shifted from my voice into the voice of my supervisor, Marcus, who had left the camp 3 weeks ago. "Arthur, buddy, the pipes are freezing. Let us in." Then it shifted again into a voice I had not heard in 10 years, the voice of my mother. "Arthur, it is time to wake up for school." The transitions were seamless, but the pitch was wrong. It was like a piano being played with broken strings, a terrifying imitation of human emotion, delivered by something that did not understand what emotion was. I took a step backward, my boots splashing in the water. Instantly, the voices behind the barricade stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I took a step backward, my boots splashing in the water. Instantly, the voices behind the barricade stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Then from the other side of the wood, I heard the sound of bones scraping against stone. Something massive yet impossibly thin was squeezing itself through the gaps in the collapsed rocks. The rotting wooden planks began to groan under a sudden immense pressure. The wood splinters started to crack. A long, pale sliver of skin pushed through the gap between the rotting timbers. It did not look like an arm or a leg. It looked like an elongated human finger, but it had 4 joints instead of 3, and it ended in a jagged, calcified tip. The finger scraped against the warning sign, peeling the faded red paint with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I scrambled backward, forgetting about the tools, forgetting about the valves. I ran through the freezing water, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the wet stone walls. Behind me, the wooden barricade did not just break, it exploded. The sound of shattering timber echoed through the 2-mile tunnel, followed by a heavy, wet impact against the flooded floor. Then came the movement. It was not the sound of footsteps. It was a rapid, rhythmic clicking, like hundreds of hollow bones striking the stone floor at terrifying speed. Clack, 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 clack. The entity was navigating the pitch-black tunnel by sound alone. I reached the industrial elevator cage, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the iron gate. I threw myself inside and slammed the lattice gate shut. I slapped the ancient green button to signal the winch house on the surface. Nothing happened. The elevator lights remained dead, the motor silent. The power grid in Sector 4 was completely severed. I aimed my flashlight down the long straight tunnel I had just escaped. The beam cut through the thick fog, illuminating the flooded tracks. 100 meters away, the water was rippling violently. Then something entered the light. It moved with the posture of a spider, but its limbs were human arms and legs, twisted backward at the elbows and knees. Its torso was elongated, ribs pushing against translucent, bloodless skin. But the head was the worst part. It was a hairless, misshapen mass of flesh, and resting right in the middle of it was the top half of Marcus's face. His exact eyes, his exact forehead, but below the nose, the flesh split open into a vertical, toothless cavern that stretched all the way down to its chest. The entity stopped the moment the halogen light hit its eyes. Marcus's eyes blinked rapidly, unaccustomed to the brightness. Then the vertical slit on its chest expanded and it spoke. It used Marcus's voice, but the volume was deafening, reverberating off the stone walls until my ears began to bleed. "Arthur, why did you leave the station? You know the company policies regarding shift abandonment. Come out of the cage, Arthur. Let us fill out the incident report." The words were completely corporate, completely mundane, but the creature was vibrating with a frantic, predatory hunger. Its limbs twitched, its backward joints snapping in the darkness. I did not answer. I grabbed the manual emergency crank on the side of the elevator wall. It was an old heavy iron bar designed to manually move the gears in case of total power failure. I began to turn it with all my strength. I grabbed the manual emergency crank on the side of the elevator wall. It was an old heavy iron bar designed to manually move the gears in case of total power failure. I began to turn it with all my strength. The gears groaned, and the elevator cage slowly, agonizingly, rose a few inches off the ground. The clicking noise instantly resumed. The creature launched itself forward. It did not run on the floor. It scrambled along the jagged stone walls of the tunnel, defying gravity, its multiple limbs jamming into the cracks of the rock. I cranked the iron bar faster, my muscles burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cage rose 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. The entity reached the shaft. A pale, four-jointed hand slapped through the iron lattice bars of the elevator floor, narrowly missing my boot. The smell hit me instantly. It was the smell of ancient, stagnant water mixed with copper and copper dust, the scent of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. I raised my heavy iron wrench and brought it down on the creature's fingers with everything I had. Cracked the calcified tips, shattered, and a thick gray fluid oozed from the wound. The entity did not scream in pain. Instead, it released a chaotic burst of overlapping voices, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all screaming different phrases at the exact same time. "Watch out for the cave, and the radio is dead, Mummy. It is dark. Turn off the light. Please let me go." The wall of sound was so loud it felt like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, dropping the wrench, but the momentum of my last crank kept the elevator moving upward. The creature's face pressed against the bottom bars of the cage. Marcus's eyes stared up at me through the iron mesh, filled with a cold, empty curiosity. Then the vertical mouth opened, and it whispered in my own voice, "See you at the top, Arthur." With a sickening surge of speed, the entity turned and began to climb the vertical rock walls of the elevator shaft, disappearing into the blackness above me. It was not chasing the elevator. It was racing it to the surface. The elevator cage continued its slow, painful ascent through the vertical shaft. The mechanical creak of the manual crank was the only sound keeping me anchored to reality. I kept my flashlight aimed upward, staring into the square opening of blackness above. Every few seconds, the beam caught a glimpse of the jagged rock walls, but the entity was gone. It had climbed into the dark upper levels with the speed that no human or animal could ever match. My hands were covered in blisters, my chest heaving from the exhaustion of turning the heavy iron bar. By the time the cage finally groaned and reached the platform of Sector 3, my arms were trembling. Sector 3 was an abandoned storage tier, filled with rusted mining machinery and rows of old wooden supply crates. The air here was slightly colder, meaning I was getting closer to the surface, but the silence was absolute. I pushed the heavy lattice gate open and stepped onto the wooden planks of the platform. The yellow beam of my fenner swept across the room. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for decades, except for the floor directly in front of me. There were wet, dragging marks in the dust. The tracks did not look like footprints. They looked like someone had dragged a heavy, wet sack of meat across the floor, leaving a trail of that same thick gray fluid I had seen in the shaft. The trail led straight toward the secondary breaker room, the only place where I could reset the main power for the elevator. If I wanted to reach the surface cabin, I needed that power. I walked slowly, my boots making no sound on the dusty floor. I kept my flashlight low, trying not to catch the attention of whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I approached the metal door of the breaker room, I heard a sound from inside. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like a finger hitting a glass window. I reached out and pushed the door open. The hinges let out a sharp, rusty scream inside. The room was small, cramped with electrical panels and high-voltage switches. Sitting in the far corner with its back to me was a human figure. It was wearing a thick winter parka with the company logo on the back. The hood was pulled up. "Marcus," I whispered. The wrench gripped tightly in my right hand. The figure did not turn around, but the tapping stopped. "Arthur, is that you?" the figure asked. The voice was perfect. It was Marcus's voice, but it did not carry the corporate deafening tone from the tunnel. It sounded tired, frightened, completely human. "I survived the collapse in the shaft, Arthur," it said, its shoulders shaking slightly as if it were shivering from the cold. "I scrambled up the old emergency ladders. I have been hiding here for hours. The thing down there, it took my legs, Arthur. I cannot walk." I took a step closer, the flashlight beam hitting the back of the hood. "Help me get to the elevator." "We need to get out of this mountain," Marcus said. My heart wanted to believe him. The human brain desperately craves comfort when it is trapped in the dark. But then I noticed the edge of the workbench next to the figure sitting on the wooden table was a pair of dirty, insulated work boots. They were still tied, still attached to a pair of severed, bloodless legs that ended at the knee. The figure in the corner did not have legs underneath the winter coat. The coat was just draped over the top half of a pale, elongated torso that was rooted directly into the floorboards. The creature had not just killed Marcus. It was using his upper body like a puppet, a lure to make me walk into the center of the room. "You are not Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a hard whisper. The figure stopped shivering. The shoulders went completely stiff. Then, with a series of wet, cracking sounds, the head did not just turn. The entire upper torso of Marcus spun around inside the jacket, rotating a full circle until the face was staring at me. The eyes were wide, completely bloodshot, but there was no life in them. They were glassy, like the eyes of a dead fish. Below the nose, the vertical slit opened all the way down the front of the jacket, ripping the heavy fabric apart. Inside the tear, instead of flesh and bone, I saw dozens of small, pale human hands, all twitching and reaching toward the air. The creature released a heavy, wet sigh that smelled of rust and decayed copper. "You are a very observant employee, Arthur." The bottom half of its body was a tangled mass of long skeletal arms that functioned like the legs of a centipede. It scrambled over the workbench, knocking heavy metal tools to the ground with a loud clattering din. I did not hesitate. The bottom half of its body was a tangled mass of long skeletal arms that functioned like the legs of a centipede. It scrambled over the workbench, knocking heavy metal tools to the ground with a loud clattering din. I did not hesitate. I slammed the heavy metal door shut, and threw the iron latch into place. Instantly, something massive slammed against the other side of the door. The steel plate bulged outward, the rivets groaning under the pressure. Thud, thud, thud. "Open the door, Arthur. We need to clock out for the day," the voices screamed from the other side, now overlapping in a chaotic, frenzied panic. I ran back toward the elevator platform, abandoning the breaker room, abandoning the power grid. I knew I could not use the elevator anymore. The entity would just tear through the cage if I tried to crank it up by hand. The only other way out of Sector 3 was the old escape ventilation shaft, a vertical tunnel with a rusted iron ladder that led straight to the surface cabin. It was a grueling 400-meter climb in the pitch black. I found the heavy iron hatch of the vent shaft near the back wall. I threw it open, the cold air from the surface hitting my face like a physical hand. I climbed inside and began to ascend the rusted rungs of the ladder. My flashlight held between my teeth. Below me, in the main room of Sector 3, the sound of the metal door breaking open echoed through the dark. The entity was out, and it knew exactly which way I went. The cold air from the surface was a cruel joke. It made my lungs burn with every deep breath as I forced my arms and legs up the rusted iron rungs. The ventilation shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a man of my size to climb without his shoulders scraping the jagged metal walls. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of my tool belt striking the iron rungs echoed through the shaft. I felt like a bell ringing in a church tower, announcing my position to everything inside the mountain. I looked up. The flashlight between my teeth cast a narrow beam into the vertical tunnel. The metal walls were coated in thick white frost, reflecting the light into a blinding, disorienting glare. The top of the shaft was invisible, lost in the freezing fog drifting down from the Alaskan surface. Then, from deep below me, a sound. Screech, screech. A hollow metallic scraping echoed through the ventilation shaft. Something was climbing into the tube. It did not care how narrow the passage was. Lost in the freezing fog drifting down from the Alaskan surface. Then, from deep below me, a sound. Screech, screech. A hollow metallic scraping echoed through the ventilation shaft. Something was climbing into the tube. It did not care how narrow the passage was. I looked down between my boots, aiming the flashlight into the darkness below. Nearly 100 meters beneath me, the white frost was being scraped away by long, pale limbs. The entity forced its elongated body into the shaft, its backward joints snapping and cracking as it squeezed through the metal cylinder. It was climbing far faster than any human could. Marcus's dead face stared straight up at me. Its bloodshot eyes locked onto my boots. "Arthur," the creature whispered. The voice traveled through the metal shaft like an echo. "You forgot to sign your timesheet." The voice grew closer, vibrating through the iron walls until my ears ached. I climbed faster. My gloves tore against the frozen rungs. My knees slammed into the steel walls, bruising beneath my winter trousers. 50 meters. 100 meters. The frost became solid black ice. My right boot slipped. I dropped several feet before catching a lower rung with a violent jolt that nearly tore my shoulder from its socket. The flashlight fell from my mouth. Its yellow beam spun through the darkness, painting the shaft with frantic circles of light. Then, it struck the creature's face. The light revealed another nightmare. The creature had changed again. Its pale, four-jointed fingers had grown even longer, digging into the ventilation seams like claws. The flashlight bounced off its twisted skull and disappeared into the abyss below. Darkness swallowed everything. The only light left was the faint gray glow filtering down from the distant surface. The clicking was directly beneath me now. I could smell stagnant copper, rotten oil. I could feel the vibration of its body traveling through the iron ladder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy industrial lighter. The tiny flame burst to life. Its weak yellow glow threw long, monstrous shadows across the frozen walls. I looked down. A pale hand rested on the rung, only 2 inches below my left boot. The vertical mouth on its chest slowly opened. A blast of hot, foul air struck my face. This time it did not use Marcus's voice. It spoke with the voice of my father, the man who had died in a hospital bed in Anchorage 5 years earlier. "Arthur, son, help me up. The ladder is so cold." The imitation was flawless. It twisted my stomach into a knot of raw primal grief. But the eyes, they were still Marcus's eyes, wide, unblinking, completely hollow. They stared up from the top of the creature's misshapen head without the slightest trace of life. I slammed the heavy iron lighter down onto its pale fingers. At the same instant, I threw myself upward, catching the next rung with both hands. The creature did not let go. Instead, the vertical slit across its chest stretched even wider, revealing dozens of tiny, pale human hands writhing inside the wound. The small hands reached outward, cold fingers wrapped tightly around my ankle. Then, they pulled. The force was overwhelming, like being dragged into a massive industrial machine. My grip began to slip. The freezing metal tore through my gloves, peeling the skin from my palms. I screamed, a raw, broken scream. Using the last ounce of my strength, I slammed my right boot against the wall. Boom! The heavy rubber heel struck the metal panel with a deafening echo. The sheet metal cracked, bending sharply inward. I grabbed the jagged edge with my bare hand, ignoring the pain as it sliced deep into my palm. I drove it straight into Marcus's glassy eye. Gray fluid burst from the socket. The creature answered with a deafening shriek, a chorus of every voice it had ever stolen. The icy hands released my ankle. The creature tumbled backward through the shaft. Its twisted body crashed violently against the iron walls, falling deeper and deeper into the darkness of Sector 4. I never waited to hear it hit the bottom. I climbed. I climbed until my arms were completely numb, until every breath tasted like blood. 10 minutes later, my head struck solid metal, the surface hatch. I shoved against it with my shoulder, screaming as the frozen latch refused to move. It was sealed shut beneath the Alaskan blizzard. I threw my full weight against it. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the thick ice outside shattered. The hatch burst open. I dragged myself into the blinding white storm, collapsing onto the wooden floor of the surface cabin. I slammed the heavy hatch shut behind me, then locked every massive security bolt. For the first time, I believed I was safe. The wind howled outside, The cabin walls groaned beneath the force of the storm. I lay on the floor for what felt like forever, bleeding, breathing, listening to the blizzard. Then, I realized something was wrong. The cabin was not empty. The emergency radio crackled with soft static, and sitting silently in the operator's chair, with his back turned toward me, was the silhouette of a man. The emergency radio on the desk buzzed with soft static. A steady, hissing white noise filled the small wooden cabin. The silhouette in the chair never moved. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, as though it were listening to the storm scratching against the frozen windows. The cabin was freezing. The surface generator must have failed hours ago. Only pale blue moonlight filtered through the thick ice coating the glass. I remained on my hands and knees beside the hatch. Blood dripped slowly from my torn palms. Drip, drip, drip. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to disappear into the frozen wilderness. But there was nowhere to go. 300 miles of Alaskan wilderness separated this cabin from the nearest civilization. "Who's there?" I whispered. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to disappear into the frozen wilderness. But there was nowhere to go. 300 miles of Alaskan wilderness separated this cabin from the nearest civilization. "Who's there?" I whispered. Then the figure spoke. It used my voice. Not the frightened voice I had moments ago, but the calm, confident voice I had 3 weeks earlier. "Arthur, you should never have looked in the mirror this morning." I stared at the heavy winter parka. It was identical to mine. Even the small grease stain on the right sleeve, left behind by a leaking pump valve in Sector 2. The figure slowly stood up. Every movement was unnaturally smooth. It turned toward me. Moonlight fell across its face. My face. Every scar, every strand of stubble, every exhausted detail. It was like staring into a perfect mirror, except its arms hung just a little too low. The fingers were slightly longer than mine. They twitched in perfect rhythm with the distant pounding of broken pumps beneath the mountain. "Which one of us," it smiled, "is supposed to go back down?" The smile looked human, but the skin never wrinkled. It stretched too tightly across the skull, like wet leather dried beneath the sun. I stumbled backward until my spine struck the steel ventilation hatch. My hand found the emergency fire axe. My fingers wrapped around the wooden handle. "You died in the shaft," I screamed. "I watched you fall. I blinded you." The duplicate tilted its head. Its pupils expanded, swallowing every trace of blue. The slit across its chest remained closed. Instead, the skin along its throat began to ripple. "Marcus was very loud," it said. Its voice shifted smoothly between mine and Marcus's deep baritone. He did not understand the company restructuring, but you, Arthur, you have excellent survival metrics. The thing stepped forward. Thud. A heavy boot struck the floor. When it lifted its foot, thick gray fluid oozed from the seams of the leather, the same ancient substance. From the depth of Sector 4, I didn't wait. I charged. The fire axe swung in a desperate arc. Thwack. The blade buried itself deep into its shoulder. There was no cracking bone, no blood, only the sickening resistance of dense, wet flesh. The duplicate never flinched. That empty smile never faded. It looked down at the axe, then back at me. "That," it whispered, "is a safety violation, Arthur." With a violent snap, its arm bent backward, metallic, wrong. Its pale fingers wrapped around my throat. The grip was like a hydraulic vice. The freezing touch burned my skin like dry ice. It lifted me completely off the floor. My back slammed against the cabin wall. Then, something beneath us moved. A deep vibration rolled through the wooden floor. The clicking had returned. Thousands of hollow bones climbed the iron ladder below. The creature had never died. It had only sent a scout ahead. Now, the rest of it was coming. The slit across the duplicate's chest slowly opened. Dozens of pale human hands reached from the darkness inside its ribs. Their frozen fingertips brushed against my chin. "We are ready," dozens of voices whispered together, "to process your resignation, Arthur." The small, frozen fingertips brushed against my chin. Their touch left behind a trail of numb, lifeless skin. My vision began to fade. Black spots drifted across my eyes as the duplicate squeezed the last breath from my throat. But the human mind does not surrender to death so easily, even in a freezing cabin, even while staring into a nightmare wearing my own face. My left hand still gripped the handle of the fire axe buried in its shoulder. I couldn't pull it free, but I could put my weight behind it. With one final surge of adrenaline, I drove both heavy winter boots into the duplicate's chest. Using the axe handle as a pivot, the force ripped the blade downward through its torso. The parka split open. Gray fluid burst across my face. The duplicate released a wet, gurgling hiss, like air escaping from a punctured tire. Its grip loosened. I crashed onto the floor, gasping, dragging freezing air back into my burning lungs. It staggered backward. The massive wound oozed thick gray sludge, but it never fell. The tiny pale hands hidden inside its ribs began stitching the flesh together. Finger joints snapped, working with impossible speed. Behind me, the security bolts on the ventilation hatch began to shake. Bang, bang, bang. Something enormous slammed against the hatch from inside the shaft. The steel bent upward. Ice exploded from the seams. I looked at the duplicate. Its twisted arm was already straightening. Those glassy eyes never left mine. Then I looked toward the window. Outside, the Alaskan blizzard raged without mercy. The wilderness promised death, but it was still a kinder death than whatever lived inside that cabin. I grabbed the heavy metal chair and hurled it through the frozen window. Glass exploded outward into the storm. The freezing wind roared inside. Papers flew through the room. My lighter died instantly. I didn't hesitate. I climbed over the shattered frame and threw myself into the white darkness. I hit a deep snowdrift so hard it drove the air from my lungs. Then, a deafening roar shook the cabin. The ventilation hatch had failed. For one brief second, I looked back. In the moonlight, a towering mass of flesh poured through the broken floor. Twisted limbs, frozen faces, all merging into the duplicate's body. Then hundreds of voices cried out, using my own voice. "Arthur, where are you going? Your shift isn't over." I turned away from the facility. The mountain disappeared behind the storm. I crawled into the endless snow. The cold struck like a hammer. Ice formed across my eyelashes. My injured hand became completely numb. I had no compass, no flashlight, no destination, only one thought: keep moving away from the mountain. I walked for hours, or maybe only minutes. Time means nothing when you're freezing to death in the Alaskan wilderness. Every direction looked exactly the same, an endless white void beneath a black sky. My legs grew heavier with every step. Step, step, step. Finally, my knees gave way. I collapsed into the snow. The cold swallowed everything. I couldn't feel my fingers. I couldn't feel my toes. Then a strange warmth spread through my chest, the false comfort of severe hypothermia. My mind whispered, "Just close your eyes." Then the wind stopped. Silence returned. Deep, heavy, absolute. From somewhere above me, a familiar burst of radio static crackled. "Shh, Arthur. St. Do you copy?" I forced my frozen eyes open. Standing over me, untouched by the storm, was the duplicate. Its coat was spotless. Its face was calm. Its eyes were perfectly blue once again. It knelt beside me. Its expression was gentle, almost caring. It reached out a hand. "Come inside, Arthur." It spoke with my own voice. "The heater is working now." The duplicate reached out his hand. Its pale, elongated fingers hovered only inches above my frozen face. I couldn't move. The blizzard had locked every muscle in my body. My vision narrowed into a dark tunnel. Then I noticed the one thing it had failed to imitate: the reflection. Moonlight shimmered across the snow around us. But inside those perfectly blue eyes, there was no reflection of me, no reflection of the moon, only a deep, endless darkness, as if the eyes were nothing more than empty windows looking into a vacant room. I didn't take its hand. I no longer had the strength to fight, but I still had the strength to refuse. I let my head sink into the snow, closing my eyes against the false warmth of its voice. If I was going to die, I would die as Arthur, not as another voice trapped inside that mountain. The duplicate released a slow, disappointed sigh. The gentle concern vanished from its face. Its voice flattened into something cold, mechanical. Subject demonstrates high resistance to integration, initiating alternative processing. I braced for agony, for those pale hands to tear me apart. Instead, the ground began to shake. Thump, thump, thump. A distant rhythm rolled beneath the snow. A blinding white light burst through my closed eyelids. Not moonlight, not my flashlight. Industrial floodlights. The duplicate shrieked, scrambling backward into the darkness as the roar of twin propellers swallowed the storm. The company had finally noticed the total blackout at Blackwood Ridge. A rescue helicopter had been dispatched from Fairbanks. I never saw them pull me from the snow. I never saw the duplicate disappear into the trees. Everything faded into darkness. 3 weeks later, I woke in intensive care. The doctors called it a miracle. I had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. My right ankle would never fully recover. They explained everything: methane, carbon monoxide, hypothermia, hallucinations. Every impossible thing had a reasonable explanation. The company visited twice. Expensive suits, perfect manners, perfect smiles. They offered enough money to erase a lifetime of debt. All I had to do was sign. I signed. I took the money. I disappeared into the Arizona desert, as far from snow and frozen mountains as I could get. I believed sunlight could burn away memory. I was wrong. Yesterday, an automated email arrived. Blackwood Ridge Mining, Human Resources. My employee file required an administrative update. Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was my original incident report. Routine, clinical, corporate. Until I reached the signature page. My name was there. My exact handwriting, but the timestamp wasn't dated 3 years ago. It was dated tomorrow, 2 a.m. Now I'm sitting alone in my living room. Outside, the Arizona heat still presses against the windows. There is no snow, no mountain, no mine. Yet the air inside the house has changed. It smells of rust, old oil, stagnant water. It was dated tomorrow, 2 a.m.